This video will provide an introduction to specially designed instruction and more broadly, Section 7 of the Individual Education Plan, the IEP. So we're going to start off by really just talking about what Section 7 of the IEP entails. So this is where we're really talking about all of the services and instruction and accommodations that a student might need in order to meet the goals that are created in Section 6 of the IEP. This is called specially designed instruction because it should be specially designed for each individual student. So in essence, these are services that are different from what all students are receiving. So for example, if all students are receiving a specific kind of curriculum, this would be something in addition to that, or it would be more time using that program, or it would be instruction that looks similar but may be accommodated or modified for that particular student. There are 7 specific areas that are covered in Section 7: specially designed instruction, related services, assistive technology, accommodations, modifications, support for school personnel, and services to support medical needs. We're going to go through each one of those areas now. So as we go through, I'm going to define each of the terms and show you how you would complete that in the written document. So specially designed instruction is a clear definition of what that instruction is going to look like for each specific goal area. So if I have a goal for reading fluency, I'll have a clear definition of what my instruction for reading fluency will look like. If I have a behavioral goal, my specially designed instruction should address how I am going to instruct or teach to that specific goal. This should be in addition to what is already happening in that general education classroom. It should be special. It should not be the same as what everyone receives. In specially designed instruction, you also have to define the person who is responsible for that instruction, how much time each week the student will receive that specially designed instruction, and the location of services. This is where we really start to talk about least restrictive environment and making sure that we're not putting students in settings that are too restrictive, but that we're making sure they have access to the general education classroom as much as possible. When you're actually filling this in the document, you're going to see there's a header for specially designed instruction. This is where you're going to define what that specific instruction will look like. So oftentimes schools will use very generic statements saying specially designed instruction for reading will be direct and consultative education services, or it will be explicit instruction or small group learning. We want to make sure that those statements are not generic, but are definitely representative of what that student needs. So if a student needs explicit instruction in phonics with vocabulary practice, put that in there. If it's really important that a student is in a group of no more than 5, put that in there. If a student needs one-on-one learning, put that in there. It's really important though with one-on-one learning that we're very cautious. We don't want to say that a student needs one-on-one learning unless it's absolutely necessary, because that does limit how you can provide services throughout the day. So that means you would not be able to have anyone else join that group, which could be restrictive to you as a teacher as well. This is also important here that we're listing the provider titles and goals that are addressed. So if our explicit small group phonics instruction is helping students in both reading fluency and maybe reading comprehension, we can put that both of those goals are addressed through this specifically designed instruction. But every goal must be addressed somewhere on this page. Then the provider title is typically the intervention specialist, but it could also be the general education teacher. And then you want to put what the location of services are going to be. Every time that you have a different location for the services or a different provider title, you need to have a new line that looks just like this. So you'll add a row underneath and then you'll address it. Each goal area or each different type of instruction will also need a separate row. So you might end up having 4 or 5 different rows that look just like this that address several of the goals. So you won't necessarily have just one line under specially designed instruction. It is very appropriate, though, to include the general education teacher within these services. The amount of time and the frequency is really going to depend on the intensity of services that a student needs. So for example, if a student is below the 10th percentile, not showing a lot of growth on their progress monitoring chart, you might have more time throughout the week that a child is working towards those goals. If a child is currently receiving 20 minutes a day of services and they seem to be making good progress, then you would keep those services at 20 minutes a day, or you could calculate that weekly as well. The next column in section 7 is related services. Related services are things that are related to the goals. Everything in this section needs to be related to the goals, but aren't necessarily about the instruction. So they might be other things such as transportation, developmental or corrective services, things like speech and language, interpreting services, maybe counseling, occupational therapy. This could include things even such as parent counseling, and we'll talk about how that fits in there. They might need access to a school nurse or other medical services. So typically in the initial IEP or ETR, these services are outlined, what supports we're going to need. So typically you know these things coming into the IEP. It's just a matter of how much time and frequency you're going to include. So again, similar to specially designed instruction, for every new related service, you need a new row that looks just like this. So for example, if I have speech and language services that are going to take place throughout the school year, I would put those on here. I would say how many minutes a week or a month. In many cases, related services are monthly. And then if I had to also add occupational therapy, I'd add another row that looks just like this. The beginning and the end time of these services will match the beginning and end time of the IEP. The next row is assistive technology. Any item or equipment or product that helps to provide access to the learning environment or to even things like extracurricular activities or specials. These are things that would be considered here. Most students will have access to assistive technology in the school. When we include it in the IEP, we are saying that this student requires this in order to have access to a specific area. So for example, we might have a lot of students using calculators. But if a calculator is not necessary for them to access the curriculum, then we don't need to put it under AT. We could put it under an accommodation, which we'll talk about next. But if these things are absolutely necessary for a student to participate in the curriculum, then we need to place them here. Typically in AT, we see more high-tech devices, things such as voice synthesizers or talk-to-text software. And so we don't always include these low-tech things such as pencil grips, calculators. Those tend to fall under accommodations, but could be here if the team determined that this was more a form of AT and not just an accommodation. There is something called the SET framework, which we won't get into in this class, but it is a document that allows you to, as a team, determine if it is necessary for the student and the environment for this child to have AT. When you're writing it in here, it'll be similar to related services. You'll list the type of equipment and the minimum amount of time that a child would need to use that tool or device. So particularly when we're thinking of talk-to-text software, we want to be cautious that we're not putting too much time in there because we may enable the child from learning some of this specific things that they need to. So we do need to be careful with that. It is critical that when AT is written into an IEP that there is a district representative signing off on that because it often means there's a cost to the district. So it's very important that this is not a decision that's made without the district representative present. The next section is modifications. Modification is when you're actually changing the learning goal or standards. So when we're adjusting the instructional level, when we're changing the amount of learning that's happening, or the learning is different than what other students are doing. So this is typically when we shorten assignments, we reduce homework, we change the instructional level. So for example, if a third grader needed to identify 8 parts of the flower, and we told a particular student who had modifications that they only had to be able to identify 3 parts of the flower. That would be a modification because we're changing the actual standards or outcomes of that learning. An accommodation, however, is when we're just adjusting more of the physical and environmental aspects of that learning to give students access. So for example, when we're talking about that flower example, if we still said the child had to identify all 8 parts of the flower, but we gave them maybe a word bank to help them choose which vocabulary words to put on a model or on a chart. That would be an accommodation. We're not changing the outcomes of the learning, but we're giving them a tool to help them. This is where things from our low-tech AT could be pencil grips and calculators, assignments read aloud, repeated instructions, extra time. We're not changing the expectations for the learner, but we're giving them different access to the learning. Accommodations and modifications can be written all into one spot. So unlike the other sections of the IEP Part 7, you only need one row here, and you can put as many different things as you want in there. Again, you want to talk about the different settings that are going to be needed. Where are these accommodations going to be happening? Are they going to be happening in all classes? Are they only happening when the child is in general education classrooms? So we really want to make sure we're considering all of those things. We also want to make sure that we use the same beginning and end time as the IEP. Another difference that can happen here is that we don't need to be specific about the amount of time or frequency. Here we can be more general and say as needed, because we won't always need these same accommodations and modifications. All right, the last 2 sections of 7, these are not always filled in. These are often ones that are for more medically fragile students or students with significant behavioral or health needs. So support for school personnel is any training that might be needed for specific teachers. So for example, let's say that we have a new voice synthesizer that we're using with a student, and they are working with a teacher and a paraprofessional. Perhaps this teacher and paraprofessional have never used this software before, and therefore training would be put into the IEP to make sure that anyone supporting this child would have access to that specific training, whether it's at cost to the district or not, to put it in there. Perhaps we have students with significant behavioral needs, and they need to learn how to provide CPI, which is a form of sort of restraint for those students that can keep other students safe. There might be that type of training written in there. So there's lots of different things where we might need to provide specific training for school personnel. Support for medical needs is when we're looking at other types of things. So for example, medications that need to be dispensed daily at school. Perhaps you have a child who has diabetes and their insulin needs to be tracked throughout the day. Maybe you have a child with seizures and people need to know how to care for that child. So in that case, with the seizures, it could fall under medical needs as far as making sure a nurse or somebody is aware, but it also could be a training under support for school personnel that everyone needs to be trained on how to deal with a seizure in the classroom. And again, you're going to define these the same way. You're going to write them in similar to accommodations and modifications, and the frequency in this situation would not be necessary. So you'll see it's kind of blocked out. Here you just need to talk about what supports need to be put into place and the beginning and the end time. Again, these services tend to fall on IEPs for students who are more medically fragile and will not be as common as the other areas of IEP Section 7.